So, my name is Blythe Gilbert. I'm an intern here at the Eurac Research Institute. Today is day one of our International Summer Research Institute. This year is titled States and Nations, Diversity, Domination, and Legitimacy. I'm here with Dr. De Varennes. His program this morning was entitled The Rights of Minorities, Diversity, and Neo-Nationalism. The Tyranny of the Majority is Not the Only Game in Town, which I think was a great way to start off our program. So I'm here to ask him a couple questions additionally on top of that. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
I very much enjoyed your talk. So my first question, your talk noted that conflict against or persecution of minorities is rising today and that it's at some of the highest levels we've seen since the end of World War II. You also mentioned that the UN framework of human rights has very few methods of enforcing the principles enshrined therein, and that many states see this framework more as guidelines than as a binding treaty. So broadly, how do you think that the UN can approach human rights violations or minority conflicts within nations such as China or India, for example, where such issues are viewed as the sovereign domain of the state? Are there any other alternatives to sanctioning or to simply increasing the enforcement mechanisms of the frameworks? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think there are two ways of looking at the issue you've raised. First of all, in relation to countries such as India and China, and when they may consider, for example, that human rights issues are mainly an internal matter, and that each country has their own priorities. It's to their benefit also, and benefit to their own citizens, to have the universality of human rights recognized. We've had situations, for example, during the pandemic, where the Chinese government actually insisted that Asian Americans and Chinese in the United States be protected, because as you may remember, there was a lot of hate speech directed against Asians. So it is rather ironic that at that point, for example, the Chinese government insisted that Asians should be protected and that they had human rights essentially, and that the government of the United States had to do more to combat, if you will, anti-Asian hate. At the end of the day, it's for everyone's benefit, including Chinese citizens, including Indian citizens, that their rights be protected around the world. They not be subjected to discrimination or hate speech and so on. And so it's for everyone's benefit that these rights be truly universal and respected. Hence the importance of actually having a consensus on what those rights are. That's what we call international human rights. And the importance for these governments to recognize that they want their own people to be protected outside of China or India, their rights protected. They have to also protect or recognize the importance of these global standards. That's one level. Second level, however, it is true that when we talk about the international human rights architecture, we have something very weak in terms of implementation mechanism. Basically, it's left to states to enforce or not international human rights obligations. It's a weakness. It's a major weakness. We don't have an international court of human rights. States have not been able to accept or agree on that. We do have an international criminal court, which was a significant progress, but obviously we need much more in order to be able to actually put into practice what is being presented as universal standards. And I guess the best way to answer that is that this is an unfinished story. We have to remember human rights in international law is actually a very young process. Historically, it's actually a few decades. It's not much. So, we did very well, especially in the 70s, 80s, 90s. We need to do much better now and actually try to have something in place where governments can be not forced, but perhaps led to actually accept and conform to these international obligations more.
It's a very good answer. It is difficult to come up with that sort of legal framework. I mean, even from my own research, coming up with a definition of genocide was a particularly difficult thing, depending on who you ask. So thank you for that. My second question is, your talk also mentioned the effect that social media has had on rising hate speech online, and pointed out that a significant portion of this hate speech is directed against minorities. However, moderating social media has been a particularly difficult task. I'm thinking specifically in the context of the US, but also around the world, where moderation by corporations is sometimes considered to be fake or potentially inept or otherwise suspect or biased. But moderation by the government is often considered to be an infringement of free speech, the right to speak your mind. So, could you give me an example of what you think to be a successful instance of social media moderation, be it a specific law or a specific set of community guidelines that you think has done a good job of moderating online hate speech? And if nothing comes to mind for a specific example, more broadly, how do you think that governments can approach the rapidly evolving field of social media and deal with the increasingly important issue of online hate speech?
That's a very complex series of points, really, of questions. Let me answer you in this way, or a couple of ways. First, we need to move away from the legal immunity that social media platforms actually enjoy in the United States in particular. There is legislation, I forget the exact provision, I think it's Article 237 of the Federal Communications Act or something similar, that basically means that social media platforms cannot be sued for even if they create harm. This is a kind of immunity which other media, such as television, radio, newspapers, do not enjoy. I think part of the problem is that social media have enjoyed a free ride for too long. They are extremely, in fact, they're amongst the most profitable and businesses in the world, and yet they actually are protected under US legislation from most forms of prosecution. I think in the United States and other countries, this form of immunity have to be removed. If you actually can show that social media platforms contributed to real harm, and we know that that is the case, that are atrocities committed, where it's actually social media that propels people to start lynching members of minorities. And hate crimes are quite often motivated directly by postings in social media. If you hit social media where it hurts, in the pocketbook, and actually provide for their liability for harms that are caused, I think that this opens the door to what needs to be the most proper balance. You cannot have free speech that actually leads to incitement to violence and commission of atrocities. Newspapers are not allowed to do that. Television are not allowed to do that. Why would social media have a free run right now? And they still do to a large degree. So I think we need to address that. Social media social media are a global problem. I personally think there should be a global treaty to deal with these forms of hate speech and incitement to violence in social media. But maybe that's pie in the sky, but at least I think there needs to be this discussion. And the importance of that kind of global treaty is that it also provides guidance to states and to social media that also can have provisions to protect freedom of expression that needs to be protected, but also saying, in some cases, if you cross this line, you're going to be liable. So I think that's the general answer. A more specific answer, I think you cannot rely on social media to police themselves. I simply don't believe that. In Germany, they have an agency which actually, I forget the details of how it works, but if there are reports of incitement to violence, for example, or incitement to commit a hate crime, the agency gives a very short period of time for the social media to remove these postings. If they don't, they actually, once again, are fined. I think there's a financial cost. And this agency has been in operation for a few years and does provide perhaps a kind of framework. Now, I'm not familiar enough with the details to actually say whether this really works or if it's a good approach, but I think it's something we need to look at. And especially because even though this seems to restrict freedom of speech, you do not have absolute freedom of speech to hurt others.
Right.
So there has to be a balance, and I think we need to actually start thinking along those lines. Because right now we have situations of incitement to genocide. We have situations where we know there are attacks against synagogues, against mosques, that are actually encouraged and actually propagated in this sense, encouraged through social media. And until now, I think we've been too timid to actually say, well, these are the problems. We have to start looking at this, including imposing liability on social media platforms, as we have for other media. So those are two of the general approaches I would seriously suggest needs to be looked at.
I think I agree. An organization like they have in Germany might make it a bit easier, considering the difficulty of even bringing major news networks. I'm thinking of the Fox News Dominion case. It's extremely difficult to bring any sort of libel case because of the free speech precedent. So perhaps an agency like that would be a more effective means of dealing with social media, which spreads everywhere and is almost instantaneous.
But I think it's also ironic that there is this double standard between the mainstream media, or printed and radio and television, and social media. I think initially when the social media was beginning, you wanted to encourage these kind of businesses and you protected them from liability, from the consequences, in fact, of what they're doing. In this day and age, when these are so profitable, this is an anachronistic legacy that time is really has to be removed, because it actually, in a sense, gives impunity to media or postings, or those who use social media, that allows them to propagate hate speech and encourage hate crimes with almost no consequences. Surely we can move away from that.
I agree. Twitter is no longer just a place where you talk about what you had for breakfast this morning. It's much more of a serious political environment at this point.
Not only political, but also what it really is a fertile ground for bizarre conspiracies, distorted concepts or perception of reality, but also dangerous messaging and encouraging people to actually hurt others, of dehumanizing others such as minorities. The amount of hate speech that targets minorities is mind-boggling in social media, and that cannot be allowed to continue, because it's creating conditions, as we saw Nazi Germany doing when it had very effective propaganda with the newer media such as movies at the time. We seem to forget media was actually a very modern media like radio, television, and movies helped the Nazi propaganda machine to raise intolerance and racism to the extent where genocide was possible. Social media today is in some parts of the world is serving the same purpose.
Yes,
and we're just too slow in handling that, in tackling that.
It's a very good point. Well, thank you, Dr. De Varennes, for your interview. That was excellent. I hope that you will join us for the rest of our time here at the International Summer Research Institute. And Dr. De Varennes, thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Cheers.